last class, and I wanted to address that, and and I'll take it from there. Um, Asaf Gozlan had asked the question on the chat whether there ever had been a king of Israel who abdicated, and it was a really good question. And I started thinking about it myself, kind of racing in my mind from what I know of the stories of Tanakh, the um, Malachim, all the different kings and everything. And I could not really come up with a case, and so far I have not, um, of a king who abdicated. And I wanted to share with you an interesting an interesting situation that did happen. And one of these days, when we get to Malachim, the books of Kings, we'll learn it in context. But today, I just wanted to show you briefly before we get back into chapter 5 of Shmuel Bet, 2 Samuel, the closest that I'm aware of a king abdicating. Now, by abdicating, in other words, we're talking about um, someone who's the king and basically saying, I'm stepping down. And we really don't see that. I was even, the way my mind works is I immediately start thinking of presidents of the United States. I like to compare things historically, and I look for examples from other societies. How does that match? And really, as I think about it, I guess I don't know if you want to call it abdicate, I guess the only president I could think of who quote unquote abdicated or stepped down would be Nixon in the heat of the Watergate battle. Rather than face impeachment and rather than face being thrown out, he stepped down. It's a strange kind of an abdicate. It's kind of not exactly abdicating. Normally, when someone abdicates, he's basically saying, I've had it. I want to get out of here. Not that he's pushed out and on the way out screaming, I'm abdicating, I'm abdicating. But that's what happened with Nixon. I can't think of any former president in the United States in 200 years of this country plus where they voluntarily gave up. I mean, there were those who were assassinated, those who died of illness in office. Zachary Taylor, I believe, had to be replaced in office by Millard Fillmore, and there were one or two others who got sick. Was it Hart? I'm not sure if it was Harding and Coolidge or something. But there were two or three who died, and there was that horrible situation that happened with James Garfield, where he was shot, and he probably would not even have been assassinated. And there's a lot of reason people say it was his medical doctor who killed him accidentally by what they did in the old days, where they would bleed you, and he wanted the fame. The doctor wanted the fame of being the doctor who saved Garfield, so he wouldn't let any other medical people get involved in the treatment, and he didn't know what he was doing, so he got all the fame he wanted just for the wrong reason as the guy who probably killed Garfield. Among the kings of Israel and of Judah, remember there's going to be a split kingdom, so we're going to have kings on both sides. The only thing that is even close, and this is interesting, because what it tells us is that even when they faced impending doom, disaster, and knew that they would be the first ones to face it, as let's say Ashur was coming in to wipe out the 10 tribes, or as Babylonia and Nebuchadnezzar were coming in after Judea. The kings never sort of abdicated and said, here, you have it, hot potato. They stayed till the bitter end. Okay, the last minute, not that they abdicated, but they fled from the palace to kind of escape with the hope that if somehow we get out of this, I'm coming back. I'm not handing it over to anybody else. Here's the one case I wanted to share with you. And to really get a very interesting case of King Uzziah and his son, King Yotam. And this actually, although it's briefly referred to in the book of Malachim, I think it was Malachim Aleph, Malachim Bet, 2 Kings, I'm not sure, was that chapter 5 or so? It's really, you really read the story in Divrei Hayamim Bet, 2 Chronicles. That's a book people don't normally study, but Chronicles has a lot of stuff that's that sort of augments what's in the book of Kings, and actually even before that. So let me learn that with you briefly, and then let's get into the day's text. Thanks for being here, and it's kind of just an interesting subject. Let's go into it. 2 Chronicles 26. The one case of a king who did not abdicate, but he agreed to let someone come in while he was king and to share the kingship, the monarchy with him, the throne. That's the closest I could get. Not that he stepped down, but that he stepped aside while holding on to the monarchy and had a second person come in, namely his son. I'll do it mostly in English because we're not going to spend the whole class on it, but it's such an interesting question, and I wanted to share with you what I learned. So all the people of Yehuda, that's the southern kingdom, by then there was the civil war, took Uzziah, and he was only 16 years old when he became king. And he became the king. And he rebuilt a lot, and he restored it to Yehuda, etc. After the king Amaziah slept with his fathers, in other words, was buried in the family plot. Uzziah was 16 when he became king, and he reigned 52 years until age 68. By and large, through most of his years, he was a tzaddik, he was righteous. Asa vayasa yashar be'inei Hashem, k'chol asher asa Amaziah aviv. He did righteousness, yashar, as his father did, and therefore he was blessed by God. He applied himself to the worship of God during the time of Zechariah, Amevin Beroto Elokim, who was like an Avi. Uvimeid showed Hashem, Hitzlicho Elokim. In those years, he worshipped Hashem, he sought Hashem, he sought him out, and God gave him all success. Everything he touched turned to success. Always the Philistines. From Saul to David, always the Philistines. Sort of like Israel's situation with the Arabs. No matter how many wars, no matter what, they keep coming back. Never stop. By Frotzet Chomat Gat, the city of Gat, that's where Goliath came from. And he broke through the walls of Gat, and he made war, and he succeeded among the Philistines. By Azrehu Halakim al Plishtim, Bial Arvim or Aravim, Hayoshvim Begur Baal Hamunim. Interesting reference to Arabs. There were no Muslims until the 600s of the Common Era when Muhammad came around. Before then, there were no Muslims, but ethnically, there's a reference to Arabs here in 2 Chronicles, for example. They were an ethnicity. And they were there near the Philistines, but they were not sovereign. There was nowhere that they were particularly sovereign. They were just Arabs. They were like nomads. They were wanderers. So God helped them against the Philistines, against the Arabs who lived in Gurbal, etc. And the Ammonites actually paid tribute. That is to say, the Ammonites, those are the ones on the east side. I've shown you the map many times. In order to have peace, they had been beaten previously by Israel, and to have peace, they would pay taxes, duties to Israel as a show of fealty to be left alone. And Vayelech Shmo ad Lavo Mitzrayim. So he became known from one side of Israel to the other side, from east of the Jordan River where the Ammonites were, to the south where Egypt is. Ki hachazik ad lamala, because he just got stronger and stronger, higher and higher. And everything was great for him. But Ibn Uzziyahu Migdalim B'Yerushalayim, he built towers in Jerusalem. And everything was fabulous. And then something happened. What happened is he became so successful that he became too successful and assumed for himself a bit too much honor. Ki Meknet Rav Hayalo, he had all the cattle and Bashvilav and Mishor, Vayachtzov Barot Rabim. In those days, they didn't have oil wells, they had water wells. You didn't need oil wells to run a car, but they didn't have like nowadays where you just open the faucet and you get water. It was a very valuable thing to have water wells. Everywhere he dug, they came up with water wells, and he had cattle, and he had everything. Ikarim v'chormim beharim b'karmel. He had everything he could ask for. And he had farmers. Remember, we've learned on Thursday night the power of the king to recruit people, to basically conscript them, even against their will, to take their land. So he had farms. He had in the Carmel. He had everything you could ask for. Karamim, that's Karam, that's vineyards. He had everything, and he had Chel Osa Milchama, Yotzet Savalik Dud B'Mispar Pekudotam, and he had a big battalions, an army, big army, everything you could ask for, and it goes on and on and on, and on and on and on, and on and on and on. And then what happened? With all this, he even manufactured for his day devices that would have been, I guess you'd get patents today, clever devices, chishbonot, machshevet choshev. He made clever items that they could put on towers for shooting arrows and large stones. Like nowadays, you have the latest inventions, the F-15 and the F-17 and the latest kind of submarines. And so in his day, he came up with, not only was he all these other things, but he was an inventor. And so he was gigantic. It's interesting that we don't talk about him more often, because he was so famous that Vayetzeh Shmo ad lemei rachok. His name was known far and wide everywhere. Rachok means far away. For he was helped wonderfully, and he became strong. All right. And when he became that strong, because he had everything, he grew arrogant. Gavali bo ad lahashchit. His slave, his heart, raised up, became haughty to the point of destruction, self-destruction. Vayam al b'Hashem Elokav, and he trespassed against God. What does that mean? How does he trespass against God? Vayavo el heichal Hashem. He, a non-Kohen, went into the Beit HaMikdash and wanted to offer a sacrifice. Lahaktir al mizbach haktoret. He wanted to offer incense. That's forbidden to anyone other than Kohen. And he had become that great that he decided that's what he wants to do. Now, I remember an old Twilight Zone episode. I guess they all are old Twilight Zone episodes. There was an evil guy, and somehow he made a deal with the devil or something, and in return for his soul, when he dies, he was granted immortality that'll never die. And he signed it, and he's never going to die. And so he didn't care that he's promising the devil his soul when he died, because he's not going to die. So he started doing things crazy, and he found he didn't die. He tripped or something in front of a train on the tracks, and the train ran over him, and he just wiped himself up. And he did this, he got hit by a car, he saw nothing. So he goes on the top of a building, and he jumps like 50 floors that anyone else would be dead. But he comes up and just stands up. And he starts getting bored. He starts wondering what else he could try, because he sees nothing to kill him. He made a deal with the devil. And so he decides he's going to murder someone so that he can get the death penalty and the electric chair. And now he's going to go and sit on the electric chair, and it's not going to hurt him because nothing can kill him. And he goes in front of the judge, and he testifies. He says, "Your Honor, you don't need witnesses. I absolutely did it." And this is, by the way, the old days when they punished murderers, not like today where it's, so he says, "I did it. Absolutely. Throw the book at me. Why did I do it? I felt like it." He did everything possible to get the electric chair so he could try that out. And the judge says, basically, "You're the most evil, cruel person I've ever seen, but I have a streak of kindness in me. So instead of sentencing you to death, I'm sentencing you to life in prison." He's going to be in prison for the next how many centuries? And he says to the devil, "All right, take the soul." Doesn't want to do that. And that's kind of, I'm not comparing King Uzziah to that guy, but what happened was Uzziah, he ran out of things to make himself great. You name it, he already had it. As I said, he had the biggest army, he had people working for him, he had farms, he had vineyards, he's got inventions, he's got the biggest army, people are paying him, he's got nothing left. That's the one thing I haven't done. I haven't offered a sacrifice in the Beit HaMikdash, incense. Yeah, but you can't do that. You're not a Kohen. And so he defiantly, he had gotten too big. And so what he did was he did that. And as a result, he goes in to offer sacrifice. And as he goes in, the Kohen walks in and says, you can't do this. Azariah the Kohen follows him. The Imo Kohanim Lashem, and all the Kohens, the Kohanim followed. There were Shmonim B'nei Chayil, there were 80 Kohens, and they all went to him and they said, you're not allowed to do this. It is not for you, Uzziah, to offer incense to the Lord, but for the B'nai Aharon, Kohanim B'nai Aharon, for the Aaronite priests, the ones, they only are the only ones who Mikdashim L'Haktir, who have been set aside by God. Say Min HaMikdash, Kimalta, get out of here. We don't care how famous and important and powerful you are. Get out of this temple because you're trespassing. And you will not get covet from this, from God. If you think you're going to gain more covet, more honor, not now. Well, Uzziah didn't care about that. He was holding the pan, called the censer. He's holding the pan with which he's going to burn the incense. That is the different spices are in the pan, and he's just got to light it up. And he got angry. Who are you to stop me? But as he got angry with the priests, leprosy broke out on his forehead in the presence of the priests, of the Kohanim. Zapo, Za'af is fury, rage. As he's raging with the Kohanim, Tsarat, Zorchaba Mitzchol Lifnei HaKohanim B'Beit Hashem, suddenly breaks out, V'yifnei Lav Azariah HaKohen, Harosh V'chol HaKohanim V'nehu Mitzorah B'Mitzchol, V'yapilu Misham. And it was like everybody's in shock. Here he's got a fresh, beautiful face, and suddenly, in a second, he's completely leprous, and they get him out really quickly. And he himself sees what's happening. He can't figure it out. He races out. Kinago Hashem, because God smote him. And Vayihi Uzziah Melech Mitzorah ad Yom Moto. And this King Uzziah remained leprous to the day of his death. He no longer was able to be what he had been. Vayeshev Bet Hachav Shit Mitzorah. He had to live among the lepers. He no longer could live in the palace. I'm thinking a little, it's not the same thing as COVID, don't mistake me, but I'm thinking about he's been smitten with something, he can't be among the general population. Ki nigzar b'Beit Hashem. He was cut off from God's house. V'yotam beno al Beit HaMelech shofet et am haaretz. He did not abdicate, but he had to stop reigning. And his son Yotam had to become also the king. So they were what you would call, unusual term, co-regents. And that's what happened. He was king, we said from the outset, for 52 years, but his son actually was king with him the last 16 years of that. And so that's the one case, not an exact abdication, but he had to leave, while he held on to the title, he had to leave the palace for 16 years. And in Shmuel Bet, in 2 Kings chapter 5, I think it's verses 3 and 21, it describes how he was king for 52 years, but the last 16 years, he was co-regent with his son. It doesn't go into all the details. That's why I instead just took out the Divrei Hayamim, 2 Chronicles. Now let's go to chapter 5, but I hope you found that interesting. It's a little bit of moving away from our general topic, but that question just was very interesting, and I felt I have to share it with you because I don't deserve to be the only one to have that interesting information. So let's go back to chapter 5. Where we left off last class, King David now is the king. Everybody has come to terms with the assassination of Avner. There's also been the assassination of King Ishbosheth. The two assassins who brought Ishbosheth's head to David, expecting a reward and gratitude, instead they have been executed, and their hands and feet have been cut off. Their hands, because they used their hands to kill the anointed of God, or the son of the anointed, and their feet, because they walked all night. They were so thrilled to do this horrible sin that they used their feet all night to go from the place where they killed the king to get to David in Hebron. So they were killed, and the nation certainly has come to terms and realization that David had nothing to do with the killing of Avner, and if anything, it reflected that Yoav was going to be a real problem for him going forward, and that David wanted a unified kingdom. So that's where we left off. We read the first 3 Pesukim. We'll refresh again here. Vayavohu kol Sheftei Yisrael David Hevrona. So all the Shevets, a Shevet is a tribe, all the tribes of Israel came to David in Hebron. Now, obviously, not the entire country, every last man, woman, and child. That's obviously not what happened, but many, many people from each of the 12 tribes. And I gave the example when a president is inaugurated in Washington, D.C. Not every single American goes to Washington, D.C. on the day of the inauguration, but a huge turnout comes out from people from all over the country to come at the inauguration. So it was something like that. People from all over the country. Vayomer le'mor hinenu atzmechav zacha anachnu. We are your flesh and blood. And the significance of that particular imagery or metaphor is that when they're saying we are your flesh and blood, why are they saying that instead of saying we're Jews like you? Remember, he has been king for 2.5 years. He's been king for 7.5 years in Hebron, over only the tribe of Judah. And all the other tribes have not, maybe quietly have thought he'd really be better than Ishbosheth. Just like there are a lot of Americans right now thinking there's a lot of Democrats better than Biden, and there are a lot of Republicans who don't like Trump who are thinking there are a lot of Republicans better than Trump, and there are a lot of Americans saying we can't believe we're going to have this election in November. And I'm not taking sides. Maybe I love Biden, maybe I love Trump, maybe I don't love anybody. But the point is that most people realized deep inside David's better than Ishbosheth, but Ishbosheth is our king, and that's the way it goes. And so David, for 7.5 years, is perceiving the other 11 tribes don't accept me. Only my tribe, my flesh and bones, the people that come from my 23andMe. And so what they're saying is, don't take it that we did not join with you because we felt you're a foreigner, you're not one of us. You are our flesh and blood, and we are your flesh and blood. And it was politics, as it always is. But we want you to feel that we're all not just with you politically, that like, what can we do? You got elected, we're stuck. But we are your flesh and blood, and you can look upon us that way. Okay, let's continue. That's a very important thing for a nation to basically be saying, that's how we look upon you. Again, we know in the United States for a long, long, long time, maybe almost forever, ever since George Washington, there have always been people who think the president is the least qualified person to be president. Even Lincoln had to deal with that. He didn't just get elected by unanimity. He couldn't even get his own party. It took 3 ballots and 4 people fighting for the nomination till he even got nominated. And then he had plenty of people running against him on the other side. Okay, so first of all, we want you to know we accept you. Gam etmol, gam shalshon. B'yod she'ol melech aleinu. Ata hayita hamotzi v'amevit Yisrael. And we want you to know we kept it quiet. It wasn't for us to say. We didn't want to antagonize King Saul, because it didn't take much to antagonize him. And if you did, it wasn't good. But we've always known you're the man. From the days of Goliath, we've always known when you go to war with the Philistines, you come back victorious. blessed by God. Not always that with Saul. Vayomer Hashem lecha atatir et ami et Yisrael. And we know that God made you his shepherd of the Jewish people. Now, it's worth taking a moment on that as well. The role of a shepherd. Do you notice the centrality of shepherding sheep in biblical history among the greatest Jews? Like if someone today were to ask, what is the quintessential job for a Jewish boy? You would think doctor. That's what the mother doesn't say when her child is born, my son the shepherd. And yet, Avraham Avinu, Abraham, was a shepherd. That's what he did. Yitzchak, his son, was a shepherd. Yaakov, first he met Rachel bringing the sheep from Lavan. Then he goes to Lavan, and for 20 years he's a shepherd working with the sheep of Lavan. Moshe Rabbeinu, one day he goes with the sheep of his father-in-law, Yitro, and he's out in a wild, not habited area. The commentaries say, like they ask, what was he doing in the middle of nowhere? And they say he already had such high ethics that he did not want to graze sheep on the grass that belonged to other people, because it'd be like stealing. So he went out of his way to bring Yitro's sheep to no man's land. And that's where he saw the burning bush that brought him up to the mountain and all of that. And we come to King David, who began as a shepherd. And that's how he first started. That's why Shmuel, the prophet Samuel, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent Samuel to anoint secretly, so you don't get in trouble with Saul, someone from the house of Yishai, Jesse, and he had 7 sons. First Shmuel thought it was the oldest and tallest and strongest. And God said, not this one, not this one, not this one. I want the shepherd. And so we see that God had a preference for shepherds. And what's that all about? Because you're going to be caring for my flock. And it's not just an interesting metaphor or simile, well, in this case, metaphor, I didn't say like, but it's that a shepherd has to develop a certain level of compassion. You've got all these sheep, and one sheep gets sick. And if you don't deal with that, it can spread to the whole flock. But you don't just shoot the sheep. You have to figure out how to care for the sheep. And unlike a human being, like a child says, "Mommy, I'm hungry." Sheep can't talk. And so you've got to remember that sheep needs to eat, and the sheep needs this, and the sheep needs that. And then when you bring the sheep, you got to make sure they're all coming together. And if some of them are slower, you don't just leave the slow ones behind. And the same when you come back home. There's a lot of compassion. And that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is looking for in someone who would be the shepherd of his flock. That you would not, let's say, look down upon people that are the lowest economic rung, or the lowest intellectual rung, or the least, let's say, family, the least coming from the least of families, but someone who would have compassion for every single member of his nation. That's a very big thing. And so I want to pull that out. And that's what the people are saying. Because Vayomer Hashem lecha atah tir'eh, that's what an ayin, with an aleph would mean you'll look. But with an ayin, it means you'll be a shepherd. You're going to take care of my flock, at Ami et Yisrael. And so the people accept him, Vayavo kol ziknei Yisrael el hamelech Hebrona. Every tribe had zikanim. Technically, the word zakain means old, elderly. It could simply mean an older person, or it could mean like an elder. Like the Mormons talk about their elders. Sometimes you say respect your elders, but that doesn't imply people who are the sages of the society. Ziknei Israel are the sages of the society. They're the most Torah learned, most righteous, and they are the leaders. And so they come to the king Hevrona. And I taught you once before, it's a Hebraism that if you want to take a noun, a place, and precede it by the preposition to, you could say El Hebron. El means to, or you could say Hevrona. And that's a common thing in Hebrew. So they come Hevrona, Vayichrot lahem hamelech David berit bechevron lifnei Hashem, and they make a bris. A bris is a covenant. And I've taught in the past also that when we talk about a boy on the eighth day getting a bris, technically, in and of itself, that word means covenant. And the word bris is used for many different kinds of covenants. The circumcision, that's a brit milah. That's a particular bris. It's a milah brit. The word circumcision itself simply means an incision that is circumference, that's circumnavigated. You're going around in a circle with the cut. And the word bris doesn't even convey that. So when we talk about circumcision, that's not a translation of bris, but since bris could mean so many different kinds of covenants, that's the term they came up with in English. In Hebrew, it's a brit milah. Vayimshechu et David lemelech al Yisrael, and they made David king over Israel by anointing him. That word Mashiach, the way we've transliterated it into contemporary language is Messiah. You could see how that word became, how Mashiach is Messiah. It comes from the word for anointing with oil. The king of Israel would be anointed with oil. And David, is regarded as Mashiach Hashem. He was anointed by God. And obviously, God is not a person. So God sent a Navi, a prophet, Samuel, to anoint him. But he was anointed by God. And so when God said later that he will be forever, that the ultimate Mashiach, Messiah, will come from his household, so that's why that Messiah is referred to that way. That's where the term comes from. So David becomes Melech al Yisrael, no longer just al Yehudah, but now he becomes king over all of Israel. He was 30 years old when he started, and he reigned for 40 years. He died, therefore, at age 70. He reigned for 40 years. Bechevron, Malach al Yehudah, Sheva Shanim v'Shisha Chodeshim. He reigned in Hebron, 7.5 years. And you will recall that one of the rabbinic interpretations as to why Avner died, why God set things up in a way that Abner would die at a younger age than otherwise might have been. There was one rabbinic opinion that he died because his having sustained the house of Ishbosheth meant that the rise of David to be king over all of Israel was delayed by 2.5 years. And for having delayed David's reign for 2.5 years, at least one rabbinic opinion we learned is that's why Avner was punished by God in that way. David reigned in Hebron 7.5 years. Alongside, basically, Ishbosheth was reigning during that time in Benjamin. Ubi Yerushalayim malach 33 shana. And then he ruled his last 33 years in Jerusalem. And that's when Jerusalem became the capital of the Jewish people. Because remember, before David goes to Jerusalem, the capital of Judah is Hebron, but the capital of everyone else is actually in the Benjamin territory. Jerusalem is not yet what it would become. You know, the name Jerusalem doesn't even show up in the 5 books of the Torah. It's interesting. It often refers to the place that God will choose to set his home, where God speaks to Moshe, and in other places in general to the Jews, and it will come to pass when you'll come into the land that I'm bringing you, and I will set my home in its place, in the place I will set my home. And then you will bring your first fruits, and then you will do this, and then you will do that. Never says Jerusalem. And there's a lot of discussion about that. And part of it is thought to be he didn't want the nations at that time, at the time of the Torah, to know that's where the Jews are going to center themselves. Or otherwise, some of the nations might have made it their business to occupy Jerusalem to prevent the Jews from getting in. And if you'll say, what kind of person thinks like that? That's Arabs. That's exactly what the Arab Muslim world has been doing since the year 600. So it's only been about 1600 years. Wherever they go, when they find a place that is the holiest religious place in that, they tear down that place and they put a mosque up there. And then they scream, you can't have it back because you'll be tearing down a mosque. And they haven't only done it to Jews. They've done it in India with Buddhist monasteries or mosques, whatever they're called, temples, Buddhist temples. They've done it all over the world. In fact, Erdogan in Turkey, just about 2 years ago, turned a very, very important Eastern Orthodox church in Turkey. Once was Byzantine, Constantinople, and all that stuff, and he made that into a mosque. Now, of course, the one that's most important to us is what they did to Yerushalayim. What business do they have to be on the Har HaBayit, the Holy Temple Mount? And what a coincidence. That's, of all the places in the world, that Muhammad has a dream, or has a dream that the angel came for him or whatever, from just so happened to be, what a coincidence. The same location as the Temple of Solomon, the Beit HaMikdash. There's Muhammad. He's in, I don't know, so where is he in? He's in Mecca or Medina, probably Mecca, I don't know. I don't know my Korean as well as I know my Jew. But he's somewhere like Mecca or Medina. And the story is that he had a dream, that he was brought up from that location. The whole world, all the places in the world, here he is. There's plenty of stuff, plenty of sand in Mecca. There's plenty of sand in Medina. There's like 23 Arab countries. The whole world, where does he get picked up from? Just so happens to be that location of the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. And he wasn't even in Jerusalem. But that's where he supposedly got. So suddenly that becomes the second holiest place or third holiest place in all of Islam. Well, now it's a holy place. Now they have to build their thing. So since the Romans destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, in the year 70, the idea was that the land was vacant until Mashiach comes. And when Messiah comes, he will rebuild the temple, the third temple, on that location. So to prevent the Jews from ever seeing the rebuilding of the temple on the Temple Mount, of course, we're not going to build it in Brooklyn. There might be some who want to. We're not going to build it in Brooklyn. Not going to build it, not even in Borough Park, Brooklyn. And we're not going to build it anywhere else in the world. It can only be built in Yerushalayim. It cannot be built in Tel Aviv. It's not like, well, we were in Israel, we'll build it in Tel Aviv, we'll build it in Haifa. It can only be built in Jerusalem, and not anywhere in Jerusalem, not on Rehov HaMelech George, not on King George Street. It has to be built on exactly that part of the Holy Mountain. And it's not like, well, the Arabs put up their mosque on this part of the Holy Mountain, so we'll put it up. You can't put it up on a different part. It has to be exactly there, and that's exactly where the Arabs put theirs, to prevent us from putting ours. And actually, it's such an international outrage, and it would have been appropriate in 1967 when Israel liberated all of Jerusalem, including the eastern part of Jerusalem. We won't call it East Jerusalem because Jerusalem, there's no such thing as East Jerusalem. It's the eastern part of all of Jerusalem. It would have been within Israel's rights right then and there to throw them out, blow up that temple, take it down, and then decide, do we want to build the Beit HaMikdash, or do we want to wait till Mashiach comes? But of course, Israel's leaders, and I'm going to double think them now 60 years later, they felt if we try to tear down that mosque of Omar and they were afraid what the world reaction would be. The world will become anti-Israel. So at that moment in time, the Arabs were so focused in 1967 on driving the Jews into the sea, and slaughtering every Jew in Israel, the Arabs at that moment in time were happy to get out of there with their lives. And who knows? But I want to bring out what we're learning right here now. The Torah never mentioned Jerusalem per se. And the rabbis say that's very possibly the reason. By the way, just one more footnote to this. There are many rabbis who teach that there's a reverse blessing in that the Muslims put up that mosque of Omar and everything, because it is a grave, grave Torah sin for which the punishment is equivalent to eating on Yom Kippur or eating bread on Passover. It is a grave, grave sin for a Jew, not a non-Jew, but for a Jew to set foot in the parameters of where the Holy Temple should be. And because Israel's population includes a fair share of secularists and anti-religionists and people who will do things spitefully just to be anti-religious, it is many rabbis believe there would have been countless Jews setting foot in the forbidden site. And perhaps it was because of that God allowed the Muslims to put up that thing so that Jews would not be able to, despite themselves, no matter how anti-religious they are, they would not be able to set foot in the holy sacred territory of God Almighty. So regardless of that, let's go forward. I think, okay. But it's really good to remember how they cry and they cry, the Jews this, the Jews that, Israel this, Israel. They are so corrupt and devious, and the things they do and they get away with, or they think they get away with. So David becomes the king, and he sets himself up in Jerusalem because that's where God wanted him. I'll call Yisrael Yehuda. This is an interesting wording. He becomes the king over all Israel and Judea and Judah. In other words, at the initial point, it's going to be one united country, but at the beginning, everybody still knew the land. The section of the 11 tribes of Ishbosheth was called Israel, and therefore David's country of one tribe, it wasn't called also Israel. It wasn't called quasi-Israel or trans-Israel. It was called Yehuda, Judah, because it was the tribe of that nation. It was that nation's territory. So when he first took over, he already was king of Judah. So this is how we read the text. We read it like with a fine-tooth comb. What is the text telling us? The text easily could have said, he became the king, I'll call Yisrael, the king over all Israel. Why does it say, I'll call Yisrael Yehuda? Because they still had some work to do to get together and really become united. And that brings us to the next thing, the Yavusi, the Jebusites. As we know, there were 7 tribes that the Jews were commanded to wipe out in order to liberate and take possession of our inheritance, the land of Israel. And it talks about it repeatedly. And we've covered that a lot of times on Thursday night as well in that class, that God commanded in Devarim Chaf in chapter 20 of Deuteronomy and other places, that these are the 7 nations you're going to encounter, and you are going to displace those 7 nations. Now, most of those nations by now have been displaced. From the time that Joshua came in until David becomes king on the place that we are right now, most of them have been displaced. But the Yavusi, the Jebusite nation, still was there in Jerusalem. They were the only ones that had not been displaced. And so now you got a problem. This is a problem like what we have now, right? You go into Jerusalem, you go into Judea, Samaria, you go into Hebron, you go into Shiloh, and then there are Arabs who are saying, it's our land, it's our land. And so you have that kind of mess. So that's what they had. There it's a little bit more direct because God has commanded through Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, et cetera, you're going in and taking the land. You can't really say, no matter how much of a Zionist I am or anyone is, I'm religious, I'm a Zionist, but I can't say that God said to Ben Gurion, I hereby, take this land, or that God said it to Netanyahu. We can only say that it looks like that by fulfilling our mandate from the Torah and returning to the land, it seems God is blessing that. And there are hidden blessings every day. The fact that Israel survived the 1948 independence war, 5 countries attacking a bunch of Holocaust survivors with no weapons, and Truman has an embargo, and still Israel wins. 1967, 3 armed Arab countries are launching an attack from all sides, from Syria, Egypt, Jordan. Jordan initially stayed out of it, and it's like God put it into King Hussein's mind. It was a miracle. Had King Hussein not joined in with Nasser and Syria, Israel would have had no grounds to extend up to the Jordan River. All of Judea, Samaria, what the others call the West Bank. Israel would have had no justice. It was a miracle that King Hussein went in and he did his part. Subsequently, there's no need for us to conquer anything east of the Jordan. We don't have enough people to hold on to it. And besides, we still haven't gotten complete control of everything west of the Jordan until we get rid of the Palestine Authority. Consequently, there's no need for God to put into King Hussein's mind to join in the 1973 war. All that Hussein knew is that after he lost land in 67, he's not going back again to war with the Jews. And this is how God does things. Things happen, and we see by miracle. So what's happening now with the Yavusi in Jerusalem? Everybody else is gone. They haven't gotten around to driving out the Yavusi, the Jebusites. So let's see what we're going to see. Okay. So so now David, having become king of everybody, decides to find a place that would be more central. And I don't know whether you remember, I've shown you the map many times. Jerusalem is just on the Benjamin side of the boundary. Benjamin and Yehuda share a common boundary. Yehuda the southern part, Benjamin the northern part. And right on that boundary, just in the Benjamin side, Binyamin, is Jerusalem. So what David was doing is he's moving the capital from the heart of Yehuda, and it's actually a politically, not only is it theologically God's plan to be in Jerusalem, but it's actually a politically calculated thing as well to unify the country. Because here we are, the Benjaminites. We've had the first king, Saul, next king, Ishbosheth. We've had him for 7.5 years after Saul. And now a new guy. Is the capital going to be in Hebron? Have we basically lost what we had? And David was doing, again, it was God's bidding, but it was very, very politically interesting. And I've given the example again. I always like to give examples from other societies, particularly America, because you see how real it is and how it just all makes sense that America basically was started by Virginians. The other people in the other colonies didn't know it, but in the minds of the Virginians, they're the ones who matter. No one else mattered. They were like Benjamin. That's why they had that expression, the first families of Virginia, FFV. And the first families of Virginia, first president was a Virginian, George Washington. Then they gave a sop over to Massachusetts because they had John Adams, who's a very important guy. And you know it if you've ever been to the musical 1776. Sit down, John, sit down. He was an important guy. But then right away, when they got finished with Adams, and they gave a little courtesy to Mass, they took it back. Thomas Jefferson, number 3, Virginia. James Madison, number 4, Virginia. Number 5, James Monroe, Virginia. So what you basically had is like for the first 50, 60 years of the country, only Virginia, you might have had 13 colonies, but yet only Virginians were the president. And that's why the capital had been in Philadelphia. And then they just looked at each other and said, why are we schlepping? And they didn't have buses and trains and airplanes and helicopters. Why are we schlepping all the way up to Philadelphia, where on top of it, there's a yellow fever? And let's just move the capital, Virginia. And that's how Washington, D.C. became the capital of the United States. They just moved it from Pennsylvania, inconvenient, and they moved it to Virginia. And so instead of being that overt, they did something like on the border of Virginia and Maryland. But it's Virginia. That's where the capital is. So David was also doing the same thing. He was putting it on a boundary, moving it from the heart of Yehuda to be a little bit on the Binyamin side to show I'm a man of all the people. And I really want to rule over all of you. And I'm recognizing that you're accepting me. So this is a moment of great unity, and it's a significant decision. But now that he's moving the whole entourage to Yerushalayim, they've got this problem. They've got all these Jebusites there. And by Kach HaMelech Anashav Yerushalayim, they go to Jerusalem, El HaYevusi Yoshevart, and all the Yevusi, all the Jebusites are living there. Vayomer LeDavid Lemor, Lo Tavohena. And I was going to say they forgot who's in charge. But if you want to look at it from their perspective, they're thinking to themselves, we've always been in charge. Who do these people think they are? So you're not coming in here. We're here. It's like yesterday morning, we were getting up and doing our usual Jebusite thing. And this morning, a whole country just moved in and made itself a capital. What happened? And mind you, there wasn't even a war. And like in 1967, there was a war. People knew something's happening. Can you imagine? Here's the Yavusi, minding their own business, doing whatever Yavusim do. Meantime, I don't know, they hear on the news, King Ishbosheth was assassinated, Abner was assassinated. Next thing they know, the Jews just made their home a capital. Again, it's so different from 1967. 1967, the Arabs started the war. The Arabs were looking to kill all the Jews. The land we already had been indigenous. If Jebusites want to come and claim the land that they're more indigenous, when that happens, we can go to the International Criminal Court or an International Court of Justice. Until the Jebusites show up, the Arabs have no claim of being indigenous to the land before us, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a place that God had in mind for us. But for the Jebusites, like, they can't figure this out. They weren't ready for this. And all of a sudden, look who's showing up. Look who's coming for dinner. So let's just take this off the screen as usual. Okay. So they say, you're not coming here, lo tavohena. Don't you dare come here. Ki im hasircha ha'ivrim v'hapischim lemor lo yavo David hena. There were a certain number, I'll take questions in a moment, and I'm also going to look at the chats. There were a certain number of blind people, and Iver is a blind person, and a Piseach is a lame person. And there were blind and lame people in the city. Not surprising, there would be in any city. And they said, and you're not going to come here. And they're just like using like a metaphor until all the blind and lame people of this city are gone. The chances of us letting you in, that's like the chances of all the blind and lame people in the city disappearing. Lay more as if to say, Lo yavo David hena. Well, very nice metaphor, but David was coming. Vayilko David at Metzudat Sion, he ir David. If you've ever visited Israel and been on a tour in Jerusalem, there's a section of Jerusalem called Ir David, the city of David. It's in the eastern part of Jerusalem, and that was the space. Metzudat Sion, Metzudat David, David's fortress, the fortress of Zion. Vayomer David Bayomahu, Kol Makeh Yavusi v'Yigabat Sinor, v'Rapiskim Yarayivrim, Shnuei Nefesh David, Al Ken Yomu Iver Piseach Lo Yavel Habayit. So David basically put out the word to the Jews. Look, we're going to have to fight the Jebusites. They're not going to let us come in easy. So we're going to have to fight them. And, you know, if they want every last lame and blind person, let them say that blind and lame people are people I don't like. I don't care. We're taking the city. Vayeshev David ben Metzudah vayikralo Ir David. David settled, became resident in the fortress, and as the text just said a moment ago, it became known as the city of David. But even David Saviv min Amilova Vaita, and David started building all around it. Vayelech David haloch begadol, and David became greater
and greater. V'Hashem Elokei Tzvakot imo, and the God, Lord of the hosts, was with him. Everything was just advancing forward. I'm going to read like 2 or 3 more Pesukim, and then I'm going to take a quick look at the chats and take the question. David had a great ally. You know, you often think sometimes like the whole world is against the Jews and the whole world is against Israel. And even when we learn Tanakh together, Bible, it seems that there's always somebody making war against Israel. The Ammonite and the Moabite, and then the Aram, the Arameans, and the Egyptians and the Philistines. It seems like they had nowhere they could turn. But actually, Lebanon was a friend. Not today, but then it wasn't all of Lebanon, but the city of Tyre, Tyre, Sora. The city of Tyre, it goes back to biblical times, just as Israel has cities that go back to biblical times with names that are biblical, like Bethlehem, Bethlehem, Shiloh, Hebron, Yericho, Yerushalayim, Beersheba. You have all these places, Yehuda, Shomron, Yerushalayim, all these places are biblical names. Likewise, Damascus was a biblical name, and Sora, Tyre in Lebanon. It goes back to biblical times. And Hiram, King Hiram, was an ally. He wasn't Jewish. It's not even clear in the first instance why he was such an ally. But celebrating the success of David and David's incorporating the entire nation into a united nation, capital Jerusalem, Hiram sent cedars. You've heard the expression cedars of Lebanon. Lebanon was famous for its cedars, its cedar wood. And he sent from his rich forests of cedar wood to be used in building Jerusalem. By Shlach Hiram Melech Tzor, and Hiram, the king of Tyre in Lebanon, sent Malachim El David. He sent representatives, messengers to David. Ba'atzei arazim, erez is a cedar, and cedar wood. B'chorshe eitz, and carpenters who'd be able to do stuff with the cedar wood. B'chorshe evan kir, and stonemasons capable of cutting and shaping stone. Think of the kotel, how a entire wall could stand for centuries built from stone. By Avnu Bayit LeDavid, and he built a palace for David. And with this last pasuk, we'll finish with today. By Eda David Kahechino Hashem L'Melech Yisrael, and David knew, it was clear. Here he's blessed. Everything's working out the right way. The nation's coming together. He's got his capital. He's got a foreign ally already recognizing him, sending him Lebanon. David recognized that God indeed had prepared the way to make him the king over all of Israel. And right now, God is elevating his throne, his monarchy on behalf of the Jewish people. As I get to the wrap-ups now, I'm going to look quickly at the chats because I sometimes don't catch them when I'm talking, and then I'll take Janet's question. I'd like to just point a little footnote. Almost every city, or certainly a lot of major cities, has a Jewish hospital. New York, of course, there's Mount Sinai Hospital. Jews back then were even more self-conscious about being Jewish. 1910s, 1920s, a lot of Jews did not refer to themselves as Jews. They referred to themselves as Hebrews. If you look at some of the organizations to this day, the organization that was the Reform congregations, the Reform temples, is known as the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the UAHC. The seminary that ordains Reform rabbis is Hebrew Union College. Hebrew. It was only the emergence of conservative Judaism, which is more proud and orthodox, that we started calling themselves Jews. So the conservatives, instead of calling their place Hebrew Theological Seminary, called their place Jewish Theological Seminary, JTS. And that was a big thing, to start publicly calling yourself Jew. The name Jew had become such a symbol
of self-embarrassment and shame with what the nations had made of our name. And you know how they would say, like, someone dickering over money over a price, he's trying to Jew me down. And the way they would talk about Jews became self-conscious about being called Jewish, called themselves Hebrew. And so instead of referring to themselves as a Jewish hospital in New York, they called themselves Mount Sinai Hospital. So nobody should notice that it's Mount Sinai. And in Los Angeles, which had less self-identification and less self-assurance than in New York, they didn't even want to call it Mount Sinai Hospital because too Jewish. So they called it Cedars Sinai Hospital. It's the Jewish hospital. What does Sinai, we know Sinai. What does Cedars, Cedars, have to do with a Jewish hospital? Think about it. Of all the names for Jewish hospital, like we in Los Angeles, everybody takes it for granted. Cedars Sinai, that's a Jewish hospital. But back then, what does Cedars, that we needed to get them from Hiram in Lebanon. They didn't grow it. That's not what Israel's known for, their famous cedar wood. And so it's just, now you know where that came from. They were looking for something that would show, wink, wink, it's a Jewish hospital, but only people who know the Bible really well, and only the Tanakh, not the Chumash, because the Christians know that. But the thing is, the Christians know the Old Testament up and down better than most Jews anyway. But that's why it's called Cedars Sinai Hospital. It's a crazy thing how Jews would do everything possible to hide their identity. And